We're down to the last 15 minutes of a Wednesday evening, and Paul had a great study tonight, and what I have to speak about tonight, I hope I'll have your attention for a brief time. I may not be able to get through all of the material. It's a topic that I've actually discussed with probably most of you at some point, and several of you in recent weeks even. And in order to start us off, I'd like to read, starting in Isaiah 40, verse 8. And for those of us who were here Sunday, Paul was in Isaiah chapter 40. Fortunately, the angle of where we went were completely different, but we did cover the same verses. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 8. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, but the word of our God shall stand forever. Note that this was written in a time when God's people were exiled. It was the Babylonian exile, to be specific. And of course, here we are speaking of the hope of return, the hope that they continue in God, that they will be delivered. And speaking of things that fade, such as grass and flowers, and as you can see in verse 7, it says, the grass withereth, the flower fadeth, because the Spirit of the Lord bloweth upon it. Surely the people is grass. And then the latter part of verse 8, but the word of our God shall stand forever. So as we consider that, we also see a very common passage that we all are probably familiar with in John chapter 1. And if you were to read the first 18 verses, which we will not do tonight, you will see that those first 18 verses affirm the deity of Christ and that He is the Word. And we know that deity has no end. So as we consider that God's Word has no end, that it endures forever, let us think modern day. Present day God's Word, each Bible that we may be holding in our hands or reference whenever we study. The language that we naturally speak in English. The form that the Holy Scriptures take in our natural tongues, if you will. There are many translations of the Bible. As of September 2022, the entire part of the Bible, the entire Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, has been translated into over 700 languages. The New Testament alone has been translated into an additional 16 some odd languages, and smaller portions of that into an additional 1,200 some odd languages. And so as a total, some portions of the Bible have been translated into over 3,500 languages. I did not know there were that many languages to translate. But there are a lot. In fact, it is estimated that between 5 to 7 billion copies of the Bible have been sold. It's a Guinness record. And that 100 million are sold every year. In 2014, we'll take a quick look at some of the more well-known translations of the Bible, also known as versions. The King James Version was the most read translation, with 55% of the United States population reading the King James Version. The NIV, New International Version, came in second with 19%. And then all of the other versions made up several other categories, but in the single digits as far as percentages go. If you go from 2014, which are what these statistics came from, and fast forward to the top 5 translations sold in the U.S. in 2022, the NIV has taken the lead for the number of translations sold, followed by the English Standard Version. The New Living Translation, King James Version is now number 4. And the Christian Standard Bible is 5th. Some of you may have heard of that, maybe not. And I won't go into great length as far as where did all of these come from, because it is its own study. It's very in-depth. There is a lot of history. However, there are different manuscripts where these versions are originally based. And as far as the New Testament alone goes, there are some 25,000 different manuscripts. This includes portions of manuscript, which could be pieces of papyrus or paper that are only that big around. You wouldn't even have whole pages. We're talking bits of pages. But there are that many. And the Old Testament, even though the original manuscripts have long since disappeared for over the years, which is much more extended than the New Testament documents, or manuscripts is more accurately put. They were fragile, the temple was destroyed, wars happened, but it was meticulously copied throughout the years. And there are equally a lot of manuscripts that you can attribute with the Old Testament. A fun fact, the Russian National Library has the largest collection in St. Petersburg with what is called the Codex Leningradensis. And a codex is just simply, it's kind of like a book. It's like before a book is what we know as a book with the bindings and stuff. It was basically a lot of manuscripts put together and sort of bound on the edge. But again, tens of thousands of manuscripts. So for the short time that we have tonight, I'm going to describe to you briefly what 3 types of translations, 3 classifications of translations that we have available to us. They are known as formal equivalents, dynamic equivalents, and idiomatic or paraphrasitic. Big words, so we'll take them one at a time. We'll start with formal equivalents. That's a fancy way of saying it's a literal word-for-word type of translation. And the translations that we typically read that were translated with this method are the King James Version, American Standard Version, New American Standard, New King James, ESV. So if you were to look at a chart, which I cannot put a chart on a projector or anything, but if you were to look at a chart, those would all be kind of grouped toward one side of the chart. Now, among those translations, some are a little more word for word than others, but they're generally grouped in that same classification. What formal equivalence essentially means is that they're emphasizing a fidelity to the lexical, the actual words, the definitions of those words, the lexical details, and the grammatical structure of the original language from what it's being translated from. So, word for word, literal. And those are the versions that we commonly see today. I'm going to skip to the idiomatic / paraphrase, and paraphrase is probably the easiest way to describe it. In essence, it is translated in a way that conforms to the natural expressions of our native language, so English. And not just English, but contemporary, modern day speak, the way we speak today. And so when you think of a paraphrase, for example, you are actually restating the meaning of the text or the passage using other words than the original words. So, for example, my daughter tells me that she went to school today and she has a spelling test tomorrow. And I might go to Libby and say, our daughter has a spelling test this week. That's a paraphrase of what my daughter actually said. These translations are not meant to render an exact rendition of the meaning of the source text, but rather to present that material in an abridged sort of way that is meaningful to our contemporary modern-day language, the way we speak. So that's the other side of the spectrum. You've got word-for-word literal, you've got paraphrase. Now, what kind of translations might you see with a paraphrase? You may have heard of the Passion Translation. There's one called the Message. There's another one called the Voice. There's a number of those that have been developed in recent years that are actual paraphrasing methods. By the way, there are tools available, and you can, if maybe you've heard of Bible Gateway, you cannot even find the Passion Translation on there. They won't put it on there. It doesn't meet even their standards. And now let's go back to the middle ground. What's the middle ground like? Well, that's called dynamic equivalence. And that's more of a sense for sense or a thought for thought. So it kind of tries to bridge the gap between paraphrase and word for word. It's sort of an in-between. It's really about functional reading as far as the translators are concerned. The meanings of phrases or whole sentences with the readability in mind. It does employ a more natural rendering as far as our contemporary language goes, but it's with less literal accuracy. And some of the versions that you might see with that would be the NIV, the New Living Translation, the Holman Christian Standard Bible. Some may have heard of that. There's God's Word Translation, and a number of others. And if you look at the word-for-word literal translations, that's usually at a reading age of 12 plus, or 11 plus to 12 plus. If you go to that middle ground with this dynamic, thought for thought, like the NIV is, you're looking at probably, an average reader of maybe 5 to 9 plus. And then if you go to the paraphrase, I've even seen a couple that can go to kids that are Emily's age or younger. So you're looking at maybe like 5 years old. Now, I want to make a point. All the translations, though some may be more literal word for word, some not meant to be, none of them are perfect. It's called Bible errata. There may be errors in punctuation. There may be unconventional translations. For example, the New World Translation, you won't find that one on Bible Gateway either. There may actually just be simple mistakes in there. Doctrinal bias may be included with some alterations. You may have some omissions or additions that don't conform exactly to the original text. Despite the fact that there are, it's imperfections, if you will, when translating from one language to another, there is a surprising harmony in the Scriptures. For reference, Caesar's Gallic Wars was written in the 1st century BC, Julius Caesar. There are 10 manuscripts in existence, and the earliest textual evidence was copied about 1,000 years after the original. We think of that as straight-up history fact. Compare that to how many billions of copies have been sold of the Bible. The New Testament documents have existed for nearly 2,000 years. They've been copied by hand for the first 15 centuries of that, with only some very minor textual variations of significance that don't truly affect doctrine. Now, when you do look at different versions, you can find scriptures that you can see that there could be doctrinal bias with. And so I, as a true Bible student, it is important to look at the original text, to compare translations, to use the tools that we have available. We have a lot of tools available compared to what humanity has had in previous centuries. We have dictionaries, and not just English dictionaries, but Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek dictionaries. We've got concordances. We've actually got the original languages at our disposal pretty readily. I've got an analytical Greek Bible at home, which is nearly as big as this book here, completely in Greek. But if you were to take a Greek 101 class, which one day I will do, I should be able to read that book. We've got online tools. We've spoken about Bible Gateway. There are plenty of other online tools in that to reference. We've got commentaries from scholars who have spent their lives studying the Bible. And yes, you have to take commentaries with a grain of salt, but we also have to respect that these people spent and dedicated their lives to study. So there are things that we can glean from that. And an advantage that we've had over many previous generations throughout the centuries is we can compare translations too. So with that thought in mind, I'd like to just take a couple more minutes here. And we're going to go to, I'm going to actually use this Bible because it has different versions in it. We're going to go to 1 Peter 3, verse 21. I figured it would be, I just randomly picked it. I didn't know how it would turn out. Randomly picked it because generally it speaks about baptism, and it's something that I know is important to this audience. I'm going to read 4 different versions to you. 1 Peter 3:21, King James. The like figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us, not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Amplified version. That also is more of a word-for-word translation classification, even though it adds a lot of verbiage to it. And baptism, which is a figure of their deliverance, does now also save you from inward questionings and fears, not by the removing of outward body filth, bathing, but by providing you with the answer of a good and clear conscience, inward cleanness and peace before God, because you are demonstrating what you believe to be yours through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. New American Standard. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal of God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. NIV. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you also, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a good conscience toward God. It saves you. Actually, that might have been that's just New International. It doesn't say New International Version. So, Jeff, you might have to correct me if I didn't get that word for word. Tell me, what's the point of that? Can you understand that baptism now saves you from all 4 of those translations? I even pulled it up on one of the paraphrasing ones from I think it was The Voice. And even though I shudder at the way that sentence was structured, you can still, an objective Bible student can still get the message that baptism now saves you. Considering the variations of the text, the origin of each translation, because they do use different material, and there's much debate over that, there is an incredible and venerable harmony between the translations between the translations of the original manuscripts. And in closing, I'd like us to just turn a couple pages back to 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 25, and I am reading out of the King James. But the word of the Lord endureth forever, and this is the word which by the gospel is preached unto you. The word endures forever. The theme throughout the Bible, and proven with the evidence of the translations. Even though a translation in and of its own is not entirely perfect, we still have plenty of tools available to us today, more than anybody in history has ever had, as far as the wealth and availability of that knowledge. And the harmony with which we can see outweighs all other historical documents, far surpasses them, those documents which we consider to be fact. This is one of the most convincing arguments and one of the most convincing evidences for the existence of our God and his involvement with us in our lives. I hope this has been encouragement to you. If there is anybody with a need, please come forward as we stand and sing.